Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending our slightly late starting panel today, where we are looking at the welfare and the welfare myth. The format will be our three speakers here will have a chance to talk a little bit. There'll be an option for our speakers to ask each other some questions, and then we'll be throwing it open to the floor, so that if you do want to ask any of our panelists a question, you'd be very welcome. To start with, I'd just like to introduce our three panelists. First of all, I'll just say I'm Tim Barford. I'm the organiser of VegfestUK. I'm very honoured to have three extremely interesting panellists, hand-picked, I have to say. First of all, we have Sandra Higgins. And Sandra Higgins comes from Ireland, from Eden Sanctuary, and Sandra is behind the Go Vegan World campaign, which sure many of you are familiar, has gone all over the UK and Ireland, has recently launched in Toronto, and it's the big adverts, basically saying, could you please leave the animals alone? So it's a very focused animal campaign. Our second panellist here is Kerry McCarthy, MP for Bristol East. Kerry has a number of experience of working within shadow cabinet and I believe government too, haven't you? You've worked with the government? Yeah. So Kerry's had first-hand experience of the sort of lawmaking, some of the things, and obviously with Brexit coming, the welfare claims have been racked up by the Conservative government in terms of a better trade deal. So Kerry's obviously got a lot of input on that. And our third panellist here, Christopher Sebastian, from numerous places, but especially vegan publishers. And Sebastian's been coming over to the UK here now for a number of years to join us at VegFest. Has always got some really good input. And has a kind of broader view, particularly as Sebastian spends quite a lot of time in New York, but also in the Czech Republic, as well as the UK. So, without further ado, I'm going to invite Sandra Higgins to have speak for a little bit about welfare and what you think about welfare.
Hello, and thank you everyone for coming. Other animals have rights. They have rights based on the scientific evidence that they're sentient. When we use them, when we're not vegan, we violate those rights. The logical conclusion of the recognition of sentience in other animals, which is legislated for in Europe under the Treaty of Lisbon, is that everyone is vegan and stops using them. Animal welfare is a myth. Animal welfare legislates for the breeding, exploitation, and killing of billions of animals every year. It violates their rights. The net result of animal welfare is that consumers, including the consumer that I used to be, feel comfortable about exploiting and using them. My suggestion today is that everyone puts their efforts into animal rights activism. Our resources are limited in terms of the time, money, effort, and years we have on this planet. Animal welfare will take care of itself when we work for their rights.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandra.
Okay. Actually, I'm really glad that Sandra went first, because I think she states in some ways, the ideal position that we would all be aiming for if it's on the assumption that most people in this room are vegan. I recorded a podcast for Lush, the cosmetics company. They do some really good campaigning and media activism. And I was recording this podcast yesterday, being interviewed about animal sentience, and exactly this issue came up, that are you compromising, selling out, and actually in that sense facilitating the abuse of animals by accepting, for example, there's such a thing as humane slaughter, such a thing as happy meat, and all those halfway houses towards being vegan. And the guy who was interviewing me, Charlie, kept saying, you're very pragmatic, you're very pragmatic. And there was almost like a bit of implied criticism in there, in like, perhaps I should be more radical, but I was talking very much as a politician in terms of what I hope we can achieve to improve animal welfare in the here and now. So while I entirely acknowledge the sort of philosophical basis for what Sandra has said, what I'm actually faced with at the moment in Parliament is we have a number of opportunities to influence animal welfare and the broader environmental legislation. The government is changing the way it subsidises agriculture, and one of the things that they're going to change it so it's all about public money for public goods as opposed to just how much land you own. And one of the public goods they're looking at is animal welfare. So to what extent do we subsidise farmers that are higher welfare? What do we regard as higher welfare? Because we know there's been an awful lot of criticism of some of the farmers that purport to be at the higher end of the spectrum. Do we use it to raise the bar? And what do we accept as being okay? There's also the animal sentience bill that is coming through. Sandra mentioned the Lisbon Treaty. To what extent do we try to enshrine in law the idea of animals as sentient beings, and what does that actually mean in terms of how we treat them? So I think there's a real opportunity to use that as a platform to try to raise the bar, to try to push things further, to try to ensure better protection for animals in law. But I do entirely accept that in some ways you're giving people a bit of a get-out clause, because if people feel that they can go and buy the higher welfare chicken or the higher welfare eggs, they are less likely to make the jump to being vegan. But we'll get into that, I'm sure, in the discussion. Oh, did you need that one or this one?
Thanks to both of you, like Sandy and Carrie. It's really interesting to this happened totally organically, but like you have the philosophical versus the pragmatic, and then you have me coming in like at the end with a bit of both actually in my approach to animal rights and animal liberation. And it's a really difficult position to navigate because in your heart, you do, as a vegan, want to present as a pure revolutionary, as a person who is uncompromising in attaining unconditional animal liberation, but you also feel compelled to understand the need to meet people where they are and to understand that this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and there are incremental steps along the way. And there is something to be said for being a very savvy politician, and really embracing the need to compromise in some cases in order to achieve a much bigger long-term goal. For me, the way that I see both sides of this perspective is I tell the story of how I was visiting London very recently. And I included it in one of my presentations that I did in the Netherlands, but there is a slide that I include. I took a photograph of a stand in Soho that was selling dairy, and the sign was huge over the stand, and it said responsibly raised, which of course made my eyebrows go up, and I'm like, what does that mean? So after I take my photo on my cell phone, I approach the vendor and I ask them what it means to responsibly raise animals, because in my mind that means that you make sure that they get to bed by 10 o'clock and you put them through college. And so yeah, that's which is absurd. And then he goes on this lengthy screed about how well they're cared for, and he was so genuine that it would be easy to believe him, especially if you're a person that consumes dairy, especially if you're a person that that wants these consumer end products. And and at the end of the day, it really is all a myth. And this is especially prescient for me as a Black American with a legacy of of what would be considered humane treatment, because at the end of the day, what people are arguing for is entitlement to someone else's body and their bodily autonomy because they've been treated well. And I teach a class in speciesism at Columbia University, and one of the stories that I tell in that class is the story of Margaret Garner, who was an escaped slave. I won't go into the long story behind Margaret Garner, but I'll just give you a brief overview of it. And and it has a lot of prevalence to the issue of the humane myth, or the issue of welfare or treatment. Margaret Garner was considered because she worked in the house, she was considered a house slave, and by most retroactive accounts of history or revisionist accounts, that's thought of as a better place to be than a field slave, quote unquote. But Margaret Garner understood that that's not okay. That wasn't enough. Good treatment isn't enough. She valued her freedom. She valued her liberation as an autonomous person, as a sentient person. And with that understanding, she took her family, her 4 children, and she escaped that plantation that she lived on in Kentucky. And she made it all the way to Cincinnati, Ohio. This was in, I believe, 1856, 1858. And when she arrived in Ohio, like, US Marshals had surrounded the house and there was no escape for her. That was the end of the road. And with there being no other alternatives, Margaret Garner actually took a butcher knife and she slit her youngest daughter's throat. And she killed her youngest child. Because she understood that she would rather see her children dead than raised as slaves in this system. Because Margaret Garner understood that how one is treated is not an excuse for stealing their life, for stealing their bodily autonomy, for stealing their liberation. She understood what it meant to live as a free individual. She did not kill the rest of her children, fortunately or unfortunately. But this was a mother who had that courage of conviction. And that is so important to me. And I impart that story because it's important to every single mother. And it's important to recognize the value that families have and the devastation that we cause families when we forcibly impregnate individuals of any species. We're not just talking about dairy cows, but when we forcibly impregnate individuals, steal their children, and break up their families. So yeah, like this is incredibly, incredibly important for me, and that's what I try to impart to students when I talk to them about the welfare myth and about the humane myth. There is no treatment out there that is like that entitles someone to another individual's life. And when people approach animal rights from that understanding and putting this in historical perspective, it changes their understanding of it, and it encourages them, because they're thinking more critically about these issues, to seek a more integrated and more holistic justice that encompasses everyone. So yeah, like, and I get really encouraged with the way that people engage with this content when I talk about it in the classroom. That's me. That's all I've got to say.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. I can see we've got some interesting views. They're not all the same, which is quite interesting for a panel. And obviously there's a lot of mutual respect here for everybody. We all do our own jobs. We've all got our own views. So I'm just going to ask, I'm just going to touch on this little area about use and treatment. I think it's one of the the debates that's been rumbling for a number of years. The premise is that if we focus on treatment too much, and you're talking about improving the standards for animals and all the welfare improvements, do we basically hold back the understanding that it's the use of animals that's the problem, not how we treat them? There's definitely people who say, well, if you have welfare reforms, what you're doing is you're making people comfortable with the idea of eating animal product. And you're never going to get to a point where you end the use of animals, which is the idea of veganism, is to end the use of all animals. At the same time, if you're in a position of responsibility, especially where you can perhaps influence the current conditions of animals and make life potentially considerably more tolerable, there's obviously quite a strong desire perhaps to do that. So this debate really, at what point where we focus on the treatment and trying to improve animals, does it get in a way and actually stop people from going vegan? So Sandra, I'd like your views on that.
I'm very fortunate in that my views are informed by the animals that I've rescued at Eden Farmed Animal Sanctuary. So what I've learned, because they come to us from a wide variety of situations, some of them are victims of torture and horrendous circumstances, some of them come from factory farms, some of them come from other sanctuaries. and some of them come from free-range and organic farms. All of them have in common the fact that they were selectively bred for human use. And this is where welfare measures are absolutely meaningless, because that selective breeding virtually imprisons those animals in their own bodies. So even in the best circumstances on Earth, which is a vegan sanctuary that I keep quite small, we only have about 100 animals, so they're getting individual attention. There's no expense spared in the veterinary care and the comfort and the buildings and the food that we give them. They have nicer accommodation and nicer food than I do. And still, the secondary effects of selective breeding are inevitable. These welfare labels, free range, outdoor reared, organic, are absolutely meaningless. If you look at let's look at the dairy industry. Regardless of the high welfare conditions on a dairy and the glossy labels that command a high price on the dairy products that we see in the supermarket, I remember them well, I remember them buying them. Dairy comes from the separation of mothers and their babies. It comes from the violation of males to extract semen from them and the artificial insemination of females. It comes from selective breeding where cows, principally cows, but let's not forget that goats and sheep are also used in the dairy industry. They're selectively bred to produce 10 to 15 times more milk than they traditionally would to feed their babies, resulting in something called metabolic stress. So by the time they're slaughtered, they're broken emotionally and physically, regardless of the wonderful so-called welfare conditions that we legislate for. Every one of them will go to a slaughterhouse. Look at the flesh industry is the same. Doesn't matter where they're living. They might grow a little bit slower on a free range or an organic farm than they do on a factory farm, but they're still going to have so much muscle tissue that their joints literally crack. We have seen this at Eden. We've seen the hips come out of the sockets from the weight that they're carrying. And these are animals that came from where we used to buy our animals when we ate them, tiny small farms where they have luxury living conditions and, you know, just one person looking after 15 or 20 or 30 animals. These are the animals that are, you know, these are the conditions they're coming from, and this is the result of the selective breeding. In the egg industry, every hen who lays eggs that we know is a relative of a free bird who, like blackbirds and crows, only laid 10, maybe 15, 20 eggs once or twice a year for the sole purpose of hatching her young. We've selectively bred them to lay an egg every day, with the result that the rate of cancer in egg-laying hens is virtually 100%. It's so high they're used as a model to study spontaneous ovarian cancer in humans. That laying an egg is the equivalent of a menstrual cycle and childbirth every day, and we put their little tiny bodies through that every day. Whether they live on a free range or an organic farm, whether they live in a backyard situation with a glorious orchard and a gorgeous house to go into at night, whether they live on a vegan sanctuary. So we can never give them welfare conditions while we use them. Animal welfare cannot take account of the intersectional harm that eating animal foods causes to humans and that rearing animals to use as food causes the environment. It can't. Animal welfare can never relieve the conditions that laboratory animals live in. And there was something else. Wait till I see what else I was going to say. Yeah, Kerry, you mentioned, you know, the philosophical views that I have. I would say they're not philosophical views. These are really practical views. And what I don't see politicians talking about, and I do understand in the morning, if a political party announced that they were going to support veganism, they probably wouldn't get in. But when you're in a position of power, can you not do something to give people access to the facts of animal sentience, the harm that we do to the animals and to ourselves by using them, and to provide, not give credit and benefit farmers for better welfare, because better welfare is utter nonsense. Give them some credit and help them to transition out of animal agriculture. I have a path worn to my door with farmers having nervous breakdowns from the work they're doing. They can't get out of this system the minute they try to get out of this system, they're number one faced, and I am also faced with what do you do with the existing animals? And number two, if you pull out of this system, give us back the money that we've paid you for the last few years. And most of them are already broke. None of them are making money except the dairy farmers. Nobody is talking about veganism and animal rights, and surely there is a place for that. Surely that is pragmatic. Surely there's a place for that.
Okay. The problem is that, right, I should start by saying I've been vegan, I think I'm in my 27th year, and I have spoken up in Parliament about it. There are now 5 vegan MPs, 3 of us come from Bristol, and so with the home of VegFest. And I may have had something to do with the other 2 Bristol MPs of turn-in, so to speak. So I did a debate on World Vegan Day, I think back in 2011. I've done debates about the environmental impact of the livestock sector, and I've asked numerous questions about the standards. Like, for example, most recently, I've asked a whole batch of questions about the standards in slaughterhouses, because politically there's always been a big focus on non-stun slaughter and what goes on in halal and shakita slaughterhouses, as if there's a humane version of slaughter which is being carried out in all the others. And there's a lot of instances. I don't know if you've seen, The Guardian have got a series at the moment called Animal Farmed, which is some excellent work by the Bureau for Investigative Journalism. There's a guy in The Independent as well that has just discovered that 25% of chickens that are going through a normal slaughterhouse where there's meant to be pre-stunning, 25% aren't being stunned because basically it's a massively high turnover, quick cust-cotting type exercise where they're just not doing things the way they should be done. And there is so little enforcement. The statistics that I've managed to uncover on how infrequently these places are inspected, and how even, you know, it's almost like unheard of for a slaughterhouse to be closed down, even if they've been found guilty of major or multiple breaches. So I am doing what I can to expose that. But I think, Sandra, we are not facing a situation at the moment where there's a binary choice between us of carrying on as we are or suddenly removing all animal agriculture from the planet or from this country. That is just simply not on the table at the moment politically. And in terms of my party coming to view, I said there's 5 of us that are vegan, there's quite a lot that are vegetarian, but it's not as if the party all agrees with me and it's just they're worried about what the voters think. I've got a job to do with, you know, most of my colleagues will turn up at you know, in the members' tea room in the morning and have a bacon sandwich. So, you know, there's a job to, and I think we've done brilliantly over the past year, and particularly, you know, veganism is now on the agenda in the way that it wasn't before, and there's people that are talking about the health aspects, particularly about eating processed meat. They're talking about the environmental impact, and they're talking about the animal welfare impact. But if I look at some of the things that are facing us at the moment, just the things I've been involved in the last few months, we had a debate on banning live exports. Now, you could say, you know, I don't like the idea of animals going anywhere for slaughter, even if it's just being led around the back of the farm for slaughter. Obviously, I don't support that. I've been vegetarian since 1981. I've been vegan since 1992. But if I have the chance to push for a ban on live exports so they're not being transported for sort of 24 hours in a van in stifling heat where they're crammed in and, you know, incredibly humane conditions, I am going to support a ban on that. I'm going to call for that, and I'm going to devote my energies to that. Foie gras is something else. We've got a campaign event in Parliament next week. At the moment, the production of it in this country is banned because we know that it's cruel, but imports are allowed. Well, if we can stop the imports from other countries, that means that there's a huge number of geese and ducks that will not be force-fed so that they have massively enlarged livers, and people consume that as a luxury item. Things like the fur trade, campaign against mega farms. Now, I entirely accept your arguments about dairy, and I think, you know, my starting point, I became vegan just because I found out that cows produce milk to feed their babies and not just for the fun of it or whatever. I don't think I'd ever questioned it before. But at the same time, I do think that if you look at, say, Nocton Dairy Farm, there was a campaign against that a few years ago where you were going to get I think it was thousands and thousands of cows crammed in to almost the equivalent of a shed. They would never see daylight. They'd be milked way beyond what was natural for them. I know that any cow is milked beyond what's natural for them, but these would basically be hooked up for machines for their entire life. You know, I am going to campaign against that. And if that means that you're almost giving some credibility to the idea that there's a better version of it, I think there is actually, you know, there is a halfway house that is not quite as grim as that, which doesn't mean to say it's not grim. One of the things we can push for on the more positive side as well, as I said, we're looking at how agricultural subsidies are used. At the moment, they are not used. Horticulture gets nothing. The pulse sector gets absolutely nothing. So that's one of the things, again, and a lot of organisations may have people in them that eat meat as well, but they are pushing for a link between healthy food and what we subsidise. And if we can now subsidise plant growing and healthy diets that arise from that, that has got to be a good thing, because it shows people there's an alternative. And I was thinking, as you were talking, you know, particularly about the chickens and eggs. So in Germany, they have people, you know, whenever people question me, they said, oh, I can see what's wrong with milk, but I don't get what's wrong with eggs. And then I just send them a link to a little video clip of the homogenizer machines where you get all these little chicks going along the conveyor belt and into a mincer. And they're like, oh my God, I get it now. Now, in Germany, they have apparently discovered a way of being able to sex the eggs before the chickens hatch, so they know whether it's going to be a male chicken or a female chicken. Now, and then they will destroy the eggs of the male chicken. You could say, well, that is still facilitating this pretty gruesome trade. And, you know, I went to a poultry farm, higher welfare, 20,000 chickens on a 35-day cycle. So they're killed after 35 days rather than 28 days. 2p profit per chicken if it's higher welfare. And, you know, that horrifies me, the scale, the industrial scale of that, and the fact that for £20,000 profit a year, they're getting through a million chickens. But to me, if you can destroy the eggs rather than sending day-old chicks into a mincer, that is still something that is worth fighting for. I would rather there weren't these eggs being produced in the first place, but I just take the view that if you can get daily wins, but carry on making the case and carry on explaining to people that there is an alternative, a plant-based alternative, then in some ways that is more humane than holding out for an ideal that you're not going to be able to achieve.
Can I just ask you, Kerry, Christian, can I just ask you, what if, as I found in Ireland, welfare measures increase the consumption of animal foods? In Ireland, in 2012, the barren battery cages were banned in Europe, and the enriched cages came in, leaving a lot of the public with the view that egg-laying hens no longer live in cages, and the view that it's okay to consume eggs because they're coming from great conditions. There was an increase in consumption that year, and that increase was directly related to the value pack eggs that all come from the enriched battery cages. And I think there's probably several other examples. So what if welfare measures increase the consumption of animal foods?
Yeah, I think there's a danger that, yeah, as you say, people will feel there's this alternative, I can salve my conscience by going for the happy meat and that. But I think the way the market operates at the moment is what you would be looking at would be higher welfare, but probably quite a bit higher in price. That's why we've got to be really careful the way we look at subsidies, because if you subsidise higher welfare meat production, the price will come down and you don't have that scenario. So at the moment, people are forced, if they want to go for higher welfare products, they're forced to pay more, and therefore they'll probably make the decision to consume less. But if you start, that's something I organised a round table in Parliament this week to try to resolve that issue about how you don't want to, you want to keep the higher welfare at an area, at an end of the market where the consumption is still going down as well. Although I think if you make the other arguments, like a lot of people are eating less for environmental and health reasons as well, I actually think a lot of the people that are coming new to veganism or eating less meat are less likely to be doing it on the ethical side. I see a lot that are doing it on the environmental side in particular. And the health side. I would say, I mean, the biggest dilemma we've got at the moment, there's talk about how we subsidise agriculture, but the big battle is whether we are going to enter into trade deals that allow really cheap food in from the States, where they have much, much lower animal welfare standards. And I get really angry in Parliament because the Tory MPs, almost like, every time animal welfare is discussed, they sort of boast about how we have the best standards in the world, and there's an incredible degree of complacency, and I don't think our standards are anywhere near good enough. But America is a hell of a lot worse, so there's also that battle to be had. And if we don't allow those cheap imports in from the States, what we probably would end up with is higher welfare but pricier UK produce, which would mean people would eat less. But if we open the floodgates to the States, then prices are going to come down even below what they are now, and people are going to be eating food that is basically produced to incredibly bad standards, and all sorts of health issues as well.
Wow. All right, so I had to follow up both of these amazing people. That's not hard at all. To answer Tim's original question about, about does advocating for welfare, at what point does that actually become almost an apologetic position that makes that makes animal liberation that much harder? I don't personally think that that has a direct impact on my activism individually. Because I think that our activism is a result of what we bring to it. And my position is always, whenever I engage in these conversations, it's always from a perspective of animal liberation as the goal. And as long as I continue talking about that as the goal, it doesn't mean that, just because I celebrate their smaller short-term victories, that that I don't also, still advocate for the longer-term goal of liberation. And likewise, just because I argue for prison abolition doesn't mean that I don't want to improve the conditions of people who are still existing in this system. I do think that we have the capacity to do both. I think that we're always asking people to to do more than one thing, and we have to illustrate that in ourselves and in our activism as well. One of the things that I thought was amazing that that Sandy brought up was talking about selective breeding, and what selective breeding entails. And I just have a couple of things to say to that. First, I want us to all in this room understand the value and importance and power that language has, because when we talk about selective breeding, what we're really talking about is a very pretty euphemism for eugenics. And we need to recognize that, and we need to force people to be present to that. We need to force people to be confronted with the reality of what that is, because eugenics is never an ethical thing. It's never ethical when it is done to human populations, which it's still done to human populations. It didn't stop after the Second World War. It has been used against people as far back as has colonialism existed. And we still have it present in in animal populations today. The difference between human populations is that largely we in Western society have accepted that eugenics is a bad thing when used against humans. But because of these euphemisms that we come up with, we don't really look at it as being reflected the same way in animal populations. And it's not just limited to the animals that we consume in our food and agricultural systems. This is also present in animals that are companions to us as well. When we talk about companion animals, domesticated animals, dogs and cats and rabbits, and they're complicit, or they're victims of these campaigns of eugenics as well. We steal the reproductive autonomy of every animal who is exploited. And in the case of companion animals, it's just as insidious because it's done purely for cosmetic value. It's done purely for this idea of what we think of as a pure breed of someone, which is a dangerous concept that has huge consequences for humans. Pure bloodlines and the like. And when we actually place that in perspective about what that means, this social construct, which has largely only existed for a very short time in human history, then it becomes much more real and much more frightening and important to people when we have these conversations with them. And to what Carrie was saying about about the position that one is in from politics, I think that it's fascinating that you've got someone who on this panel who is coming purely from an activist perspective, someone who's coming from the world of politics, and myself who largely approaches this from the world of academia, and the different perspectives that we all bring to this. I do understand the difficult position that politicians are in, because these are these are people who are our allies, and and we place enormous expectations on those who are our allies every day, and and sometimes it's impossible to meet those expectations because you're juggling so many different competing priorities, and some of these battles you win, some of these battles you lose, and at the end of the day you take those losses to bed with you. And that is so difficult. And that is true whether it is about animal welfare, whether it is about human exploitation, whether it is about prison abolition, whether it's about institutional racism, whether it's about gendered violence against women. Those losses are real. And and you're fighting against forces that have a lot more money, a lot more power, and a lot more influence than us, because the meat and dairy industries are, again, they're enormous shadowy lobbyists in and in the United States, we're talking about in Washington, D.C. And the most productive thing that we can do politically is to pull back the veil on the money in politics and reveal where it's coming from, and defund those sources and decenter those sources, and and get the money out of politics, so that so that people who care about these issues can make more ethical decisions based on the reality, based on what is actually in front of us. And of course, if we get the money out of politics, if we get the corruption out of politics, which some may see as a pipe dream in and of itself, the prices of these consumer products will dramatically rise. It's not that meat and dairy are so much more affordable. We're still paying for them out of our tax dollars. And and insofar as human populations are concerned, this has consequences for people who are living in poverty as well, people who have poorer health outcomes that are directly tied to the foods that we eat. So all of this is it's a rich tapestry of corruption and and despair that that starts with a dead animal. And ends with disenfranchised humans as well in our society. So
last year, I mean, a lot of people are saying that this is practical and it's not achievable. Last year, the UK, in a legal ruling, declared that all dairy products are inhumane, regardless of adherence to welfare standards. I'd like to ask Kerry, can she use that in her position to start talking about veganism and animal rights instead of animal welfare? It's a great precedent to build on, and I hope that we'll have more.
Well, I don't know the case that you're talking about, and as I've said, I have been talking about veganism ever since I entered politics, and I've had a hell of a lot of flack for doing so. So the idea that I'm not out there talking about these things, and that the only reason that the entire Labour Party hasn't gone vegan and put a ban on meat products and dairy products in its manifesto is because I haven't been saying enough is far from the case. But so I think you do have to recognise what we're up against. So if you could send me a link as to what this decision was. What I would say is, so there is an animal sentience bill. There was a big row just before Christmas, some of you may have come across it, where we were discussing whether to put a sentience provision in the EU withdrawal bill. And Caroline Lucas and I were pushing this. The government said this isn't the right place for it. We're going to bring forward a separate bill. They've now brought forward a draft separate bill, which is really, really badly worded. And the problem that we have at the moment, so that we've basically, the government is reviewing the results of the consultation. Some people are taking advantage of the fact that it's really badly worded to try to say, let's not do it at all. And they're not necessarily being honest about it. They're pretending, of course, we want sentience enshrined in law, of course we want to protect animals, but this bill doesn't do the job. And then there's others like me, and I've been talking to groups like Compassion in World Farming. Do we take the view that it's better to have a badly drafted law just so that you haven't lost, that little gain? Or do you hold out for something a bit better? So there's that whole discussion going on at the moment. But that bill is an ideal opportunity to discuss what we mean. It basically says, at the moment, it's just like a one-line clause. It says, ministers of the Crown must have regard to the welfare needs of animals as sentient beings when formulating government policy. There's all sorts of questions, even like what's meant by animals. Is it just the sort of animals you have a duty of care towards? Is it wild animals that you own? Is it wild animals as well? What do the welfare needs mean? Because in the past, all sentience has been really interpreted as is meaning they need to be fed. You can't starve an animal and you can't actually beat it. And we know that, obviously the welfare needs of animals are much greater than that. So should we be looking at things like pigs, for example? It's known that pigs are very intelligent, need mental stimulation, need toys to play with, and that. And again, we're straying into that territory of, happy pig's got a little toy to play with before it gets its throat cut. I accept that. But there's a lot of discussion, and I think we can use this legislation to try to advance the argument, try to get stronger protection in. But we do need to be united on it, because if we start sort of peeling away saying this isn't good enough, it's not going far enough, the people that don't want this to be in law at all, which is, there's quite a significant number of people that don't want it in law, they will win the day just because there's not a united front calling for better animal welfare.
Just to add to that a little bit, like a lot of this conversation today has been centered around, like, what happens if we don't, what happens if we don't advocate specifically for animal liberation and and to the detriment of of welfare. But from the other perspective, like if we don't talk about welfare at all, there's a very real example of of the consequences of that in the United States right now. The Trump administration in recent weeks has completely rolled back animal welfare laws and left the animals that are exploited in our food system virtually without protections whatsoever. So so there is a great value in working with people who are very closely tied to animal welfare, because without those efforts, we see what happens when when we lose animal welfare altogether. And that leaves us in a very scary and a very vulnerable place. So there is value in welfare, and we shouldn't diminish that value as it happens, and the necessity of it. And yeah, I do feel just on an individual level, people who are open to animal welfare, you do have a way, an open means of communication with those individuals, with those policymakers and legislators, and people in activist communities to to leave the door open for liberation, to leave the door open for completely eliminating animal products later on down the line. So we don't want to lose we don't want to lose altogether, because we do want to be so uncompromising in our values, because that does leave us in a very scary and vulnerable place.
Great, folks. Okay, look, we're actually 5 minutes from time now, so unfortunately we started a bit late. We're not going to have time for questions because we want to be able to make sure our speaker gets on the next session. But I think all our three panelists, would you be available for a quick chat perhaps, if anybody wants to ask you a question or two directly? So apologies we've had to just end before we get to that. I'm just going to wrap up, say how fortunate I think we are to have three excellent panelists, because we've got different views here, but very articulate. I'd like to say thank you too, especially for the use of language. The use of language has been very respectful. I think a very good example for activists, especially if you're watching. Please note the really good use of language from all three participants. It's a very important area. Sandra, you've done something amazing that I think history will show. The Sandra Higgins the Go Vegan World campaign is the first campaign to really get in the industry's face, I don't know how many vegans it's helped produce, but I know one thing. The dairy industry is running scared because of Sandra's work, you know. And I think Sandra deserves a massive round of applause, people, for the Go Vegan campaign. So, Sandra, thank you. And Sebastian, what I love about you is you bring, you know, as you mentioned, at academia, you bring these different views. You're so well thought out and you're so able to see different views. And again, that's something I think that activists perhaps, you know, that's a real skill to take on board, the ability to reason and debate and assess. But be respectful to other people who have different opinions. So Sebastian, once again, thank you so much for joining us. A big round of applause, please. Chris for Sebastian. And just to note that all three speakers will be speaking multiple times at VegFest, I believe. So you'll be able to catch all three speakers. And just say, Kerry, again, we are, I think, really lucky. I've known Kerry quite a number of years now in Bristol as a vegan MP. I know how much hard work she's done. She's done incredibly well. And the results are there to see. I very much like what we're hearing from the Labour Party about subsidising plant-based, and I think the key to this welfare debate actually is to just replace it with plant-based anyway. So the more plant-based subsidies, the more government support for, and it's very encouraging to see Jeremy Corbyn say he would be open to subsidies for plant-based. And I think, Kerry, I think we do respect that, you know, your day job is a little bit different from the average vegan activist. And therefore what you bring to the table about welfare is really real, and it's something I think, especially those of us who perhaps don't agree with welfare, you know, it's something to learn and listen to there. But again, a deep respect for the job you do. I know currently it's a very challenging job. Never mind the welfare of animals, the welfare of humans right now in this country is of prime importance for us all. So thank you again for coming and sharing your views. Big round of applause, please, for Kerry McCarthy, MP, Bristol East. Thank you. Yeah. So that wraps up our little panel. It has been filmed. We will put it up on our page in 3 weeks, and there'll be a bit of a debate there. So if any of you would like to perhaps join in that debate later on when we post the film and comment, and I'll invite our three panellists to be there to answer too. So thank you very much.